We are getting very close to the fantasy playoffs, and I think it's important this week to break down the best matchups for some of the players that you're deciding on if you should put in your lineup. We're not going to be talking about the obvious players, the guys like Christian McCaffrey and even your second or third round picks. You're starting them either way. We're talking about guys that are getting into your final wide receiver spot or maybe that flex spot. And we'll begin with a running back coming off of his bye week that I've gotten a lot of starter sit questions about. He has a great matchup, and that'll be Alexander Mattison, who's going to return in week 14 out of the bye in a good matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. And the last time we saw the Raiders defense, they were giving up 89 total yards and 2 touchdowns, over 20 fantasy points to Isaiah Pacheco and the Chiefs. And it wasn't just that game. On the season, running backs have taken advantage of this Raiders defense. Las Vegas allows the 8th most yards and 7th most points to opposing backs this year. Now, Mattison's role has been a bit murky basically all season and really the last couple of games before the bye week. Just to remind you, in week 11 against Denver, we actually saw Ty Chandler see a larger role in the backfield. 14 touches, 110 total yards. He outproduced Alexander Mattison in this game. But Mattison still earned more touches, but the concern was, okay, heading into week 12 and then maybe even the bye week, is Chandler going to take over this backfield or a lot more usage? Well, what we saw in week 12 before the bye week kind of stopped or at least halted for the meantime some of those questions. As you can see right here on Fantasy Life, our official data partner, all this data is free. You can check it out. It's linked down below. Mattison goes out there and he sees 67% of the rush attempts. This was his most usage since earlier in the season, all the way back in week 6. And despite in week 12 before the bye having a difficult matchup against a top 5 Bears run defense this season, Mattison still averaged over 5 yards per touch, one of his most efficient games of the year. So he's actually trending in the right direction, and if he was dealing with any small injuries, those should be all healed after the bye week. You can start him in week 14. And you could also start Jayden Reed against the Giants this week, which is one of the better matchups you can have, and we'll dive more into that in a second. But here's the thing about Jayden Reed. I saw a lot of people were let down last week by playing him because he only had 4 catches on 5 targets. 2 of those catches were like end around little pitches, so he didn't get a ton of overall downfield usage. But if you were to look at Fantasy Life, which shows you what his role was in this game, in week 13, he only ran 51% of the routes. In the previous weeks, you can see he had a full-time role, 79%, 77%. The thing was, he was dealing with an injury heading into this game. He was questionable to play, so he was limited due to the injury. Now, despite seeing his role decrease by about 30% due to the injury, he still earned 5 targets in this game. He now has 5 or more targets in 4 straight games, and this should only increase as he gets healthier heading into week 14, where he will have that beneficial matchup on the road as a 6.5-point favorite against a bottom 10 Giants secondary. This is a secondary that struggles against opposing fantasy receivers. They allow the 5th most points to the position this year, and Reed might be in store for even more targets, not just because he's getting healthier, but because Christian Watson is expected to miss a few weeks due to a hamstring injury. And earlier this season when Watson was out, Reed averaged 6 targets per game, and those were like the first 3 games of his career. Since then, he's obviously gotten a lot better, and so has Jordan Love. So expect the volume and overall production in a really good matchup for Jayden Reed to increase this week. You can start him. And he's not the only guy in Green Bay that I'm looking to start, because his teammate A.J. Dillon is perhaps going to be in the best spot of the entire week. And now, of course, this is assuming that Aaron Jones continues to miss time. And as of right now, it's at least trending in that direction. There hasn't been any positive news for Aaron Jones as of late. Over the last 2 weeks, he hasn't practiced. That continued last week. Of course, he's dealing with this knee injury. You can see on the Packers injury report, if we scroll over, DNP means did not participate. So he did not participate on Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and then he was ultimately ruled out. Normally, you might see a guy start to practice in a limited participation, especially since he's dealt with 2 other injuries this year, and then they slowly ramp him up, and then he's out again, and then he finally plays. That's usually what the Packers do, especially with their running backs, especially with Aaron Jones this year. So that means he's probably going to miss 1 more week, but track that news. And now if he does miss that week, that's going to be great news for A.J. Dillon, who just saw his role increase in week 13. You see, according to Fantasy Life's data, Dillon's snaps went up to 62%. This is up from 52% when he was basically splitting the role 50-50 on Thanksgiving Day with Patrick Taylor. And then he saw 75% of the rush attempts. And look at this, his routes run basically doubled. So his passing game usage doubled. He was a full 3-down back, which led to one of his better performances on the entire season. Maybe the most impressive performance when you consider the stakes here of how important this game was and how good of a defense the Kansas City Chiefs have been as of late. 87 total yards on 19 touches, had a really nice reception. His only reception, he broke a couple of tackles, got the first down late in that game. And this is the exact time where A.J. Dillon usually hits up. It starts to get cold. The weather gets a little bit more crummy for the 250-pound back. It's already hard to tackle him, and now it's even harder. And he'll have a fantastic matchup against a Giants defense that, depending on where you're looking, the Packers are 6.5 or 7-point favorites, should correlate with more rushing in the second half for Dillon. This Giants defense, as of right now, is allowing the 3rd most yards and 5th most fantasy points to opposing backs this season. So Dillon becomes a must start, assuming Aaron Jones misses again. Now, this next tight end has been trending up, and honestly, I think you can start him yet again. But before we get there, make sure you hit the subscribe button. 65% of people who watch these videos are not subscribed. It just takes 2 seconds. A lot of people don't even realize that they're not subscribed, and it'll allow you to more easily see my future content. Now, that tight end I'm talking about is Gerald Everett, who's kind of been this ultra talented tight end. Last year, he got got a lot of usage. He was a popular breakout player for this year, or at least a late round tight end, and it hasn't come together, but these last 2 weeks it has. Because during this time, as you can see on Fantasy Life right here, in weeks 12 and 13, he's earned 4 and 5 targets, and he's caught 100% of these targets, so 9 receptions during that time, and he has now back-to-back weeks of top 10 performances. And honestly, this is just because they have no other options in this passing attack besides Keenan Allen, at least consistent options. Quinn Johnson had a decent game last week, but overall not been consistent. But this week will be a true test because Joshua Palmer might return from IR. He's eligible to return. The question is, will he actually return this week? That's something to track because if he returns, it's going to be less likely that Gerald Everett sees a higher target share. But it's still not a sure thing that Palmer will return this week, so we have to track that. And this is a nice matchup for Everett against the Broncos. Their secondary has improved, but their linebackers still struggle against opposing tight ends. Denver actually allows the most yards and fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends this season. So like I said at the top of the show, we're not talking about the Trey McBrides, the Sam Laportas, the obvious younger tight ends that you're going to be starting every week because they're dominating and coming off of great weeks. We're talking about those fringe guys that you need to get a guy in the spot this week. If you're looking in the wasteland options, Everett is a nice find. And speaking of nice finds, hopefully you had this guy in your IR spot to start the year when he was on there. If you're in a deeper league, maybe you added him when we started to talk about it before it became obvious. But Keaton Mitchell, the new Ravens starting running back, is coming out of the bye week, and yes, you need to start him. Because as you can see right here, in his last 4 games, he's trending up every single week. His snaps, his overall rush attempts per game have looked nice, his involvement in the offense, and look at week 12. Saw a season high 46% of the snaps. Started taking the backfield away from Gus Edwards, and then they went into the bye week. And now that's important because he's a rookie who is already trending in the right direction. The bye week normally gives the coaches an extra week to just game plan in these types of players into the offense. You're probably going to see his first week of over 50% of the snaps. Now, in his last game, and basically all season long, he's been effective. 11 touches last week for 89 yards, so averaging like 9 yards per touch. He is second in the NFL behind only Devon Achane, another young player, a rookie in yards per touch this season. This is how explosive this guy has been. And now this week, he's in a great spot. He's coming out of the bye. Might see or should see a large role. He's a 7-point home favorite against an average Rams run defense. Running backs in similar spots this year, averaging over 14 fantasy points per game. Keaton Mitchell is a must start. And this one might seem disgusting, but Drake London is also somebody you're going to want to start this week, even though he had his worst performance since week 1 when he had 0 points this past game. More specifically, he went out there and he had 1 catch on 5 targets for 8 yards. Desmond Ridder struggled. This matchup against the Jets was not a good matchup to begin with. That's why the Falcons only threw 27 times. And 30% of those 27 passes were either checkdowns or throwaways. So there wasn't a lot here for the wide receivers, especially downfield. But honestly, just forget about this dud in week 13 because in week 14, the matchup is completely different and much more favorable because the Falcons are going to be taking on the Buccaneers. The Falcons this week have a nicer team total. They are 2.5-point home favorites, and the Buccaneers, they give it up to fantasy wide receivers. The Bucs are allowing the 2nd most yards to opposing receivers this year and the 4th most fantasy points per game. Heck, even Jonathan Mingo, who has struggled this season in a Panthers offense that is the worst in the league, where Bryce Young has also struggled, Mingo even got there against this team last week for 6 catches, 69 yards on a whopping 10 targets. You can attack the Bucs downfield, and Drake London is a far more talented receiver than Mingo. He's actually been efficient and good this year. London ranks top 30 in yards per route run and has averaged 7 targets per game despite the offense's lower passing volume. So this week you can start London against Tampa, and you can start a guy on the other side of this game. And that takes us to the tight end position in Cade Otton, and it's similar to London. You have to forget about last week because Cade Otton had an even worse game than London's 1 fantasy point because Otton had 0 fantasy points. Yes, Otton earned 0 targets for the first time this season, but this was obviously an outlier performance. It's unlikely to happen again. And the crazy part is this was actually the best usage of the season. So he gets his best underlying usage. His routes run in snaps, he hit 94% of the routes run, basically never left the field, and it just so happened that he didn't have a target. Again, this is a complete outlier because when Otton has seen similar usage of 85% of the routes or so, he's averaging over 5 targets per game. So expect him to bounce back this week in a nice matchup against the Falcons. Atlanta allows the 2nd most receptions and 3rd most yards to opposing tight ends this season. So if you're in a bind, I think Otton is a nice fill-in. Now, if Josh Palmer is active, I'd prefer Otton over Gerald Everett, who we talked about earlier. And now, before we keep going, I have to let you know about the partner of the program, and that is Prize Picks, and it's very simple, and a lot of people after last week and this week have reached out and said that they've enjoyed playing on Prize Picks. It's simple. You see this right here, Christian McCaffrey, more or less 80.5 rushing yards. What do you think he gets in this game? A lot of people love taking the more because it's more exciting to root for. I get all that. You pair it up with any other player here, and you have a chance to win money just based on your fantasy football knowledge. We've been partners with Prize Picks for 3 years. We love them. We love seeing their growth. We've grown alongside of them. They are a great company that I could put my word behind, and honestly, I don't put my word behind many companies. And the good people over at Prize Picks have allowed all of you guys to get in on the action with a free bet up to $100. So if you put in $20 on Prize Picks, they'll give you $20 right back for a free bet, all the way up to $100. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Now we'll go back to the wide receiver position, where I'm looking at Brandon Cooks this week in a nice matchup against the Eagles. And look, he continued his strong stretch of play in week 13 on Thursday Night Football because Cooks went out there and he scored 16.5 points. points. He found the end zone for the 5th time in the last 7 weeks. And in that game on Thursday night, he saw season high usage, running 96% of the routes. He's clearly over those early season injuries that he had. And there's a good chance this production continues this week. Again, this is a guy that I'm saying to start because he's a flex option on your bench. I think he's a nice play at home against a struggling Eagles defense. Earlier in the year, he did struggle against this defense in Darius Slay. We have to be transparent and let you know that he only had 1 catch on 2 targets for 7 yards, but this was when he was dealing with injuries over a month ago, and the Eagles secondary has struggled, dealt with their own injuries, and just gotten worse since then. Philadelphia allows the most fantasy production to opposing receivers the past month, and they're coming off of a week where, yes, it's a great 49ers team overall, maybe the best in the league, and offense, but they still gave up over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns in really just like 2 quarters of play to the 49ers, because the 49ers had no offense in the first quarter because they only had 1 possession, and in the fourth quarter they didn't have to put on the gas because they were leading by so much. So in my opinion, Brandin Cooks this week is startable in the flex spot, and he's startable moving forward as long as Dak Prescott continues to play at this MVP level. Now back to the tight end position, because I know it's a wasteland and we're going to get really deep in the weeds here. There's a couple of teams on bye, just 2 this week, but maybe you've dealt with a lot of injuries. Maybe you're in a situation where you're in a deeper league and you just need to get an extra guy in your team. Who can you choose at the tight end position? I think Tyler Conklin, if the other names we mentioned are gone, is probably like the last startable option for you because he's actually earning volume as of late. Conklin over these last 2 weeks has earned 5 and 9 targets, and in week 13 he earned targets in the first half from Tim Boyle, but then he continued late in the game to earn targets from Trevor Siemian, who has probably a decent chance, if not the clear-cut chance to start this week. Those 9 targets, 26%, led the team, more than Garrett Wilson. And now Conklin's going to actually find himself in another solid matchup this week. In week 14, he'll take on the Texans as a 6-point home underdog, so there should be some elevated passing here from Trevor Siemian and whoever else plays at any point or starts for the Jets this week. And this Texans secondary has been solid earlier in the year, but they're struggling as of late, and they are struggling against tight ends. Houston's linebackers allow the most receptions to opposing tight ends this season. So yeah, the Jets quarterback situation is gross. We don't even know who's definitely starting by the time I'm recording this, but Conklin is probably like that last startable tight end 18 to 20 range guy this week, and somebody to look into due to his good matchup. So these are the guys with great matchups this week, and this should help you make those decisions when it comes to your flex spot. Now, if you want to see the decisions you need to be making before your fantasy playoffs, I'm talking about the guys you need to get off of the waiver wire that might not seem obvious, well, check out this lovely video right here. And before you go, be sure to sign up with our partners over at PrizePicks for their limited time offer. It is a free bet up to $100 if you're eliminated from your playoffs. If you want to get more action on other games, maybe even your favorite team's game, go check it out and take those more or less. It makes watching a lot of fun, and you can win some cheddar.